Okay, so for those of you who didn't hear, who weren't able to hear, this is a very hard thing for me to prepare, and to be quite honest, I'm just going to make a disclaimer here. I'm not an expert in these matters, okay? I'm not an expert, but I do have the opinions of experts on my side, which I will share. And so I hope this can help, because the topic that I'm going to talk to you about today is probably going to be something that is very important, especially for younger Christians, because you know if you're going to college, you're going to run into science professors. Right. It's going to happen. So what I'm going to teach today is going to be about the Bible and science. And what I'm going to start off with is, first, I'm going to go over some historical aspects. Then I'm going to go over why we should learn it. And talk about some opposers of our viewpoint, which is that there is a God and that God did create everything. And we're also going to talk about allies, people who think on the same wavelength. Although they might not have the same doctrine as we do, they do support our conclusion that God does exist and that he did create things. And there is scientific evidence to prove that. So before we start, let me pray real quick. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for giving us a chance to hear from your word. I pray that you will use me as a speaker today and nothing else. I pray that you will get my flesh out of the way and help the words to come out the way that you will. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. All right. So disclaimer, I'm going to be very objective today. I'm going to talk like an academic, because this is the topic we're addressing. All right. So first, before we even begin, we have to discuss and we have to define the word science, right? So what is the word science? What does the word science mean? I didn't even know what it meant exactly, right? I kind of intuitively knew because I am a student of science. But let's see here. The word science is different than knowledge. So turn to Daniel 1:4. Let's look at Daniel 1:4. So you look at Daniel chapter 1, and we look at verse 4. It's important. Can we all agree that if two things are listed in the same sentence, it's safe to bet that they're two different things? Right. Even if they seem similar? That's the idea. So Daniel 1:4 says, "Children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans." So here it says knowledge and science in the same sentence. So clearly they're not the same thing. Right. But science is, let's see what it's defined as. In the Webster 1828, it says, in a general sense, Pastor Sluter said it's our second King James, right? As a joke, but it says here, 1 Timothy 6:20, the definition of science is, in a general sense, knowledge or certain knowledge, the comprehension or understanding of truth by facts, or truth or facts by the mind. And it has a longer definition, but I think it encompasses the word better. It says, in philosophy, a collection of the general principles or leading truths relating to any subject. Pure science, as the mathematics, is built on self-evident truths, but the term science is also applied to other subjects founded on generally acknowledged truths, as metaphysics, or on experiment and observation, as chemistry and natural philosophy, or even to an assemblage of the general principles of an art, as the science of agriculture, the science of navigation. Arts relate to practice, as painting and sculpture. Now, the term natural philosopher is actually what they used to call scientists before the word scientist became more popular to call them, because they reasoned using the laws of nature, apparently. Now, dictionary.com, just to give you a modern definition, which is really not that far off, hence, King James Bible is not that archaic, right? Yeah. A branch of knowledge or study dealing with a body of facts or truths systematically arranged and showing the operation of general laws, the mathematical sciences, as an example. Okay. So another mention of science in the Bible is in 1 Timothy 6:20. And this is going to be pivotal for setting the tone of this whole study. 1 Timothy 6 in verse 20. This is going to be what I want to focus on is helping Christians understand that science doesn't negate our beliefs. It really doesn't. There's just this idea that it has to go in opposition like our religious beliefs that there is a God has to go and butt heads with the idea of science. But that's not the truth. So that's what I want the focus to be. So 1 Timothy 6:20 says, O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science, falsely so called. I'm going to give you some examples of what I think that those oppositions of science, falsely so called, are in a second. But I believe Paul is telling Timothy to avoid scientists who claim that logic and reason is all you need to explain the world around us, not true science, which in my opinion supports God and his book. This might be controversial to some because if you've ever been to a college campus or have taken any science classes in college, you probably know what I mean. It is very controversial to believe that there is a God if you study science, especially in institutions that are like higher ranked in academia. So let's see here. Our opposition and support is our next topic. So I told you there are proponents of the idea that this world was created by God, and there are opponents to the idea. The opponents are many, the proponents are few, because, well, not a lot of people can stand up for their beliefs like that. It's hard. All right, so the so-called oppositions of science, falsely so-called in our world, and I want to give you some examples. So I've been reading a book called The Return of the God Hypothesis by a scientist named Stephen C. Meyer. I read up to like almost the halfway point, and I'm just gonna tell you this book was like a textbook. It was very difficult to read in some points, okay? And I tried to break down some other chapters, and I was like, when I get this special and general theory, the theories of general and special relativity, I was like, I don't know if I can explain this in a way that like makes sense to everybody, right? So that's not what we're focusing on today. I thought about even talking about the expansion of the universe and the Doppler effect and things like that, but we're probably not gonna make it there. We're gonna go over history first, and just to let you know, I'm not trying to make this difficult. I'm trying to make this as easy as humanly possible. So on the first page of the chapter, Dr. Stephen Meyer, he says, I live and worked in Seattle, where a few years ago, a prominent professor of evolutionary psychology, David Barash, I'm sorry if I butchered the name, of the University of Washington, authored a startling New York Times op-ed. He told of the talk that he gives each year to his students, flatly informing them that science has rendered belief in God implausible. Or as he explained, as evolutionary science has progressed, the available space for religious belief has narrowed. It has demolished two previously potent pillars of religious faith and undermined belief in an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God. This is a professor who teaches at one of our publicly funded institutions. And the first thing he does is apparently deny the religious beliefs of many in this country. That's kind of interesting. So, interestingly, I had a similar experience when I went to college. And in one of the classes that I took, the professor made a remark that was kind of well, I guess it wasn't very startling. I was kind of expecting it, but he said something along the lines of, "If you still believe in God, well, why are you doing that?" So, and I thought it was quite interesting. I was like, well, I'm going to keep believing in it, even if it's like just out of spite because I don't like hearing that. But there is good evidence for why we do. So, let's see here. A lot of I don't want to generalize, but a lot of institutions of higher education will have professors that are completely against this idea that God exists. It's because of this idea that science always has to conflict with religion, and that's not the case, as we're going to go in, because I believe, and Stephen Meyer writes, that science had Judeo-Christian origins. We're going to tell you why. But another example of this so-called opposition, right? I'm going to read from page 20 of his book. I thought this excerpt was quite interesting. He says here, Stephen Meyer writes, one incident, and just to give you context, this is this encounter happened when Stephen Meyer was in his PhD program, his first year at Cambridge. By the way, if you don't know what Cambridge University is, it's a very prestigious institution. So he was doing a PhD there. And he says, One incident particularly confirmed my perception of the religious orientation of most of the faculty. After seminars, the faculty would have often retire to a local pub for further discussion with students. Of course they're going to be drinking alcohol, right? On one occasion, a fellow graduate student from the United States, evidently feeling as insecure in these new surroundings as I was, decided to reveal proudly that he had rejected his former religious beliefs and now considered himself an atheist. This attempt to curry favor with the faculty members met with an unexpectedly dismissive response. One of the younger, hipper British lecturers in our department replied by saying, "Well, of course you're an atheist, but what else are you that makes you interesting?" I resolved at that point not to make a show of my own metaphysical opinions, as I doubted that they would have been even as well received as those of my classmate. And that perfectly sums up the experience that I had in college, because I never talked about it. But it's difficult when everybody around you is in opposition, and also you have to get a degree and get out of there, and potentially having your grade compromised because of your beliefs is a real thing. So I believe that's probably why Stephen Meyer didn't talk about it, and he has a point. So that's the kind of opposition we have. So what does actual history say about this whole thing? We'll go over that in a second. But first, let's turn to Ephesians 4 real quick, and we'll read verse 14. This is why I believe it's very important that you learn about this thing. I know this is a very dense subject, but look, this is going to come up, and if you're a young Christian, even if you're an older Christian, you might have witnessed the flaws of the scientific system and educational system in the past recent couple of years, as Pastor Gene has talked about. But let's read the verse first. Ephesians 4:14 says, "That we henceforth be no more children tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the sleight of men and cunning craftiness, whereby they lie in wait to deceive." Look, some professors are very eager to get you to just renounce your faith in God. You realize what in the excerpt that I just read, that guy from the United States who was in Stephen Meyer's doctorate program said he just renounced his faith. And that's the kind of pressure that young Christians are facing in schools. And I remember some pastors told me, one pastor told me there was a member in his church who went to the same university that I did, and he forsook his faith in God. I can see why, because when we talk about people who are opposing our viewpoint, they're not dumb. They're very smart, okay? When you talk to them, the more you talk to them, you'll realize, man, this person has really sound logic. And by that point, you're already doomed. If you're a young Christian and you don't have a basis in foundational doctrine, and if your beliefs aren't set in stone, and you don't have a reason to be well set, then you're on a tightrope. You're walking, and then like a wind blows you away, and then you just fall. You're kind of in that position if you don't settle yourself. That's why I'm talking about this, because it's that easy to fall out. So, God commands us to not be tossed to and fro, but that's hard if you're a young Christian in college. So let me give you some ammo. So, have you guys heard of Richard Dawkins? He's a very famous atheist, right? And let's see here on page 1. Let's see here. So Richard Dawkins has said this before. He says that, let's see here. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Okay, well, that's kind of a sad thing to think about, right? I mean, if you die and there's no purpose for you in life, why are you even alive in the first place? All right, so now let's talk to contrarians to the atheist perspective. Such people include renowned scientists such as Alan Sandage, former Caltech astronomer, Owen Gingerich, Harvard historian of science and astrophysicist, Dean Kenyon, biophysicist and origin of life researcher, who devised an evolutionary theory of life's origin, only to refute it himself as he researched further with a later discovery that he made by himself. James Tour is another prominent name because he's an organic chemistry professor at Rice University, and he has many peer-reviewed papers. By the way, if you don't understand, Caltech, by the way, if you don't know, is like a really research-focused institution, and it's no joke to get in there. I'm saying it's really competitive. So these people aren't just your run-of-the-mill professors. These are established scientists in their field with the point of view that supports us. That says that God did create stuff in the beginning. He created everything in the beginning. And so the important thing, again, to note, although these scientists may support our belief in Genesis 1:1, they're not going to be right with us on all doctrine, because that's kind of, you're looking for a needle in a haystack. You're never going to find somebody like that. Okay, so those are some of the proponents to our perspective. So let's go over science and its Judeo-Christian origins. Bear in mind, this is a very, very concise and small summary of some parts of the first chapter of this book, because, like I said, it's literally a textbook, okay? I thought I was reading a college textbook. But some of the concepts covered, he did a very good job of breaking it down to people that can understand. I mean, I took a lot of science classes, so many of the concepts he described were very familiar to me. So, science and its Judeo-Christian origins. So the new atheists have a perspective that says that science and religious belief have generally stood in direct opposition to each other in history. As we're going to find out, it's not the truth. But, for example, in the series Cosmos in 2014, Neil deGrasse Tyson attributes a loss of belief in God during the 17th century to the triumph of Newtonian physics. If you don't know, Newtonian physics just means the physics that Isaac Newton made. He was a genius. By the way, he believed in God, and he was the inventor of calculus, and the only reason why he invented calculus was to explain physics. This guy is a genius. One of his famous works is called The Principia of Mathematics, where he gave a bunch of equations and all sorts of stuff. But he was a religious guy who believed in God, and his belief in God directly played a part in a role in his discoveries that were so revolutionary, right? But anyways, in that series Cosmos, Neil deGrasse Tyson also insists that Newton's religious study never led anywhere, and that his religious beliefs had nothing to advance his scientific endeavors. That's quite typical of an academic, right? These days. So Meyer summarizes Tyson's message on page 17, and he does it quite well. And he says here, let's see. Tyson's message was clear. To do good science, scientists must throw off the shackles of religion, and the advance of science has allowed people in Western culture to do just that. And this is true. If you go to college, almost everybody there will not believe in God. A lot of people won't. Or if they do, they won't say anything because clearly they think it's incompatible. But let's see here. Stephen Meyer writes about this thing called the warfare or conflict model. And basically what it is the perception of perpetual and unavoidable conflict between science and faith. Basically, that science and faith have always been at odds with each other and are incompatible. But are they? Are they? What do you think? Just keep that in mind. So this idea of the warfare or conflict model arose in more recent times than you think. Professor Colin Russell, who I believe was a lecturer at, I think he's a, okay, so he is at the time that he gave this talk, he was the president of the British Society for the History of Science and a distinguished professor in the history of science at another British university, which is the Open University. And he gave a well-attended talk about the so-called warfare thesis. Professor Russell explained that the perception of a deeper inherent conflict between science and faith is a product of late 19th century historical revisionism. Two such works helped give rise to this understanding. They are John William Draper's History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, written in 1874, or published in 1874, and Andrew Dixon White's A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, published in 1896. These books appeared in the immediate aftermath of the publication of Darwin's On the Origin of Species in 1859. They foster the impression that religious critics of Darwinism threatened to rekindle the Inquisition, as historian Edward Larson has put it. Okay, so believe it or not, it's not an old-time thing, because science and belief in God has always been intertwined, and in fact, it worked to advance science in many ways. But new atheists today will tell you that no, they've always been at odds, and that it's silly to be a scientist and believe God at the same time. Well, many famous scientists will disagree with you. And they're very accomplished people. Yeah. So let's see here. Historian Edward Larson wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning piece. And by the way, the Pulitzer Prize is a very prestigious award in journalism and other things. Now, the reason why I'm saying all these credentials is because our opposition cares a lot about credentials. Yes. And that's why I'm stressing them, because credentials are important in this world. And I'm trying to tell you that people with the same or greater credentials are saying they're wrong, and they have differing opinions. This is regardless of what your professor taught you in college, this is an ongoing debate. And the most honest professors that I've talked to, at best they'll say, I mean, there's evidence, but I'm not completely sold. That's the best they'll say. I recall an instance where when I was preparing for, I did it like a tutoring session in community college, okay? I led a tutoring session. And we were talking to the professor because we were talking to him about our lesson plan and the problems we're gonna go over and the concepts we're gonna go over. And my partner said something like, oh, can't we just, I was wondering, Doctor whatever, can't we just like do away with the belief in God? Isn't that just ridiculous? That we can prove that, life came from whatever primordial soup theory that he was talking about, right? He's like, we can prove that life just arose by itself, right? To my surprise, the professor said, no, we can't. We don't know for sure. So we can't definitively say that God is totally out of the picture. That's what honest scientists do. At best, they become agnostic, like there may or may not be a God. Those are the honest people that I've seen. So historian Edward Larson says, this warfare model of science and religion became ingrained into the received wisdom of many secular Americans. In his talk at Cambridge and his later writing, Colin Russell lamented how this model of the relationship between science and religion became deeply embedded in the culture of the West and has proven extremely hard to dislodge. He has noted that the Draper-White thesis has been routinely employed in popular science writing by the media and in a few older histories of science. Indeed, though the new atheists claim to advance a new perspective, their view of the relationship between science and faith merely echoes this late 19th century historiography. Again, it's not that old. So nearly all historians of science today, apparently, according to Stephen Meyer, says, let's see here. He says here, when he goes on, in truth, a chorus of 20th and 21st century historians, philosophers and sociologists of science tell a significantly different story. These scholars include Herbert Butterfield, A.C. Crombie, Michael B. Foster, Lauren Isley, David Lindbergh, Owen Gingrich, Roger Hoykoss, Robert Merton, Pierre Dunham, Colin Russell, Alfred North Whitehead, on and on and on. He has like 20-something 9 names, okay? These people are all in favor of saying, look, the idea of religion or the belief in God and science they've coexisted together. They were not always at odds. And then he says, it goes on to say, instead, almost all historians of science today offer a more nuanced view. They maintain that although some scientists or scientific theories challenge belief in God in some periods of scientific history, in others, religious belief actually inspires scientific advance. In addition, many historians of science have shown that belief in God served both as an inspiration for doing science and as a framework for explaining scientific observations during the crucial period known as the Scientific Revolution, roughly between 1500 and 1750, in which modern science as a systematic endeavor first originated. Surprising, right? They never taught me this in school because, I don't know why, but you may guess why, but they never told me about this in school, and I thought it was really interesting when I first read about it. So, some famous figures and their beliefs about God and science, let me tell you. Have you heard of Robert Boyle? If you don't, that's okay. I'm literally about to talk about him, so don't worry about it. But Robert Boyle is one of the most important figures of the scientific revolution and the founder of modern chemistry. Yeah. All students of chemistry will understand when they have learned about Boyle's law, P1 times V1 equals P2 times V2. Don't worry about it, but this equation was used to solve so many problems involving gases, okay? And I hated it so much. We did so many problems. But this Robert Boyle, who made that law, who found out that law, says let's see here, explained, the job of the natural philosopher or scientist, as I told you, was not to ask what God must have done, but what God actually did. Boyle argued that God's freedom required an empirical and observational approach, not just a deductive one. Scientists needed to look and to find out. As historian of science Ian Barber explains, the doctrine of creation implies that the details of nature can be known only by observing them, by observation. And this idea that you have to observe things was only made possible, Stephen Meyer writes, that because people believed that God had a purpose or that there was a rational mind behind the creation of the universe, and that by observing it, you can find things out from it, rather than using the Aristotelian logic and ration model. He goes in detail about how Aristotle and his beliefs have kind of interfered with this perspective, and that once God entered the picture during the scientific revolution, I think he said in the 16th or 17th century, and people decided that there was a designer behind this thing, that's when this idea of observation took off and that science started to progress. And it arose in this system arose in the West because, and by the way, these are not my opinions. These are not my opinions, I'm telling you. This is the opinion of Stephen C. Meyer and his book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. And he says, and he mentioned something that it only arose, this system of science arose in Western culture because of Judeo-Christian beliefs. Because they strongly believe that God made the universe. Pretty interesting, right? I thought it was really cool. So let's see here. Let me show you some other famous figures in history, perhaps some of the greatest, who are in favor of God and science at the same time. The great pioneers in physics, Newton, he basically invented the whole thing. Galileo, Kepler, Copernicus, devoutly believed themselves called to find evidences of God in the physical world. If you've never heard of these names, don't worry, but these are very famous names. These are our predecessors who believed that God made things the way he did for a reason, and therefore, by observing nature, you can find evidences of God, as they said. That's my take on how science should be done as a Christian, and that's what I think, if you're a young Christian going into college, that's what you should be thinking about. So don't get disturbed by all this stuff. Trust me, when you talk to honest scientists, they're actually on the fence about it because you can't definitively prove, or you can't prove that God doesn't exist. I don't think it's been settled. And the best scientific evidence has the contrary opinion to what is mostly taught in school today. I wish this person, Stephen Meyer, went and lectured at like every college, but it's kind of hard without the support, right? So, just to recap, we just covered a very brief history of why science and a belief in God has not always been at odds with each other. What I want you to take away is that science and the belief in God doesn't have to conflict or contradict each other. It can go in the same direction. And in fact, like I mentioned, the famous figures of science back in the day and even today, they made discoveries because they did believe in God. So don't be discouraged when you go to school or when you hear on the news that, God is dead, or, belief in or advancements in science, make belief in God obsolete. Well, that's very disingenuous, I think. So keep that in mind. I want to encourage people to keep that in mind. So now the next part I want to talk about, to be honest, I was going to talk about the expansion of the universe, but I decided that it was way too textbook-like, and I couldn't break it down in a way that made sense to me. It made sense to me, but I didn't think it was simple enough. So as a result, I actually just took some of the scientific facts that I found when I was researching for the Jeopardy fellowship we had, and I am going to explain the scientific principles behind it. Okay, so the last part where we're going to talk about is scientific facts in the Bible. I don't know if I don't think a lot of people have heard about these things. So hopefully this could serve as a catalyst to you wanting to go look for these things, because believe it or not, it's laid out all throughout the Bible. Right. Turn to Job chapter 28. The book of Job has a lot of cool things about the creation of the universe. Because, and you know why? Because God's talking to Job, okay? there in Job 38, God talks to Job, and we're going to get to some verses in Job 38, but in Job 28 here, in verse 25, it's an interesting fact here. And this fact only makes sense if you understand the principle behind it, which I will explain. To make weight for the winds, and he weigheth the waters by measure. All right, what's so significant about this? Well, this explains how atmospheric pressure works. And there's no better way to say the weight, to make weight for the winds. How can the winds have weight? Well, did you know air has weight? An oxygen molecule has weight, although it might be tiny. One oxygen molecule might have a tiny amount of weight, but when you combine all the oxygen in a tiny square, let's say like a square centimeter plot of space, and you get a column of air from here to the edge of the atmosphere on Earth, and you get the force that this, the mass of air exerts on you, that is atmospheric pressure. And you can only calculate that because you have a mass, or we'll call it weight to simplify it, but because you have a mass that you can find out. So Google says, the pressure exerted, atmospheric pressure, is the pressure exerted by the weight of the atmosphere, which at sea level has a mean value of 101,325 pascals, roughly 14.7 pounds per square inch. So the National Geographic says, the air around you has weight, and it presses against everything it touches. It really does. That pressure is called atmospheric pressure or air pressure. It is the force exerted on a surface by the air above it as gravity pulls it to Earth. Make weight for the winds, right? You might argue that this is very like generic. There's, it's not specific enough. Yeah, because these terms weren't invented until very recently. This is, the writer, I bet you, had no idea what atmospheric pressure was, but he just wrote it. And lo and behold, it yields some truth, or in fact, it yields the truth about how atmospheric pressure works. So you might argue that this is very general and kind of mysterious, like, okay, I see why it might be along the same lines, but look, this was written in 1780, estimated 1780 BC. You know how long ago that is? That's like thousands of years ago, before there was any systematic approach to find these things out. And this person wrote this. That's why I'm saying this book is crazy. There's just no, it's just wonderful. When I read that, I was like, well, that's insane, because in my physics class, we did this, okay? We did this calculation to get 1 pascals, okay? We did it. That's why I know. That's why I was like, whoa, this is crazy, when I was in class. I mean, I didn't scream it out in class, but in the back of my mind, I was like, wow, dude, this is insane. So let's see. Basically, to calculate atmospheric pressure, you take the weight of all the air in a column in an area, then calculate the force it would exert upon that area. Wikipedia describes this process as, on average, a column of air with a cross-sectional area of 1 square centimeter, just a square, 1 centimeter. Okay, it's not that complicated, but measured from the mean or average sea level to the top of the Earth's atmosphere, has a mass of about 1.03 kilograms and exerts a force or weight of about 10.1 newtons. You can calculate that because you have your mass, 1.03 kilograms, and you multiply it by gravity, which is 9.8 meters per second squared. Okay, so that's how you derive atmospheric pressure. And we did this calculation in class, so this is accurate. So now you know how atmospheric pressure is explained in the Bible. Job 28:25 says, to make weight for the winds. God gave us a hint by saying wait for the winds. Okay, next thing is in Leviticus. The book of Leviticus has many things, and I think I would have done pretty well as a Levitical priest, I'm not going to lie. If you look at all their hygiene laws, I think I would have done pretty well. But let's see, Leviticus 17:11 is the verse we're going to see. And for the sake of time, I'll just read it. Sorry, returning. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul. All right, what is so important about this? Oh, for the life of the flesh is in the blood. That first part is very important. You know why? Because there used to be a medical practice called bloodletting, where physicians thought letting the bad blood out of your body would cure you of your ailments. And this was a very common medical practice for thousands of years. George Washington died in 1799 because his physicians bled him to death. Had they read, understood, and believed the Bible, things may have been different, and he might have survived. You never know. This was in the Constitution Center. That's where I found this. And bloodletting was a common practice for thousands of years. Where did I get this? Medical News Today said it, okay? I didn't say it. Medical News Today said it. This was based on the theory of the four humors, or liquids. Think of humor equal liquids, which stated that imbalances in these humors were responsible for many physical and mental illnesses. That's why they bled George Washington. Leviticus is estimated to have been written in BC 1490. That's about 2,500 years ago. The practice of bloodletting only began to fall out of favor in the 1820s. Okay? When a French physician named Pierre Charles Alexander Louis began to question the method, relatively in recent times, compared to 2,000-something years ago that the book of Leviticus was written in. Strangely, this practice of bloodletting actually still exists in South Korea as a folk remedy. So when you get like an upset stomach or something, they'll prick your fingertips, and they'll let the blood out, and then the belief is that it makes you feel better, but I don't believe in that, but I don't believe in that in light of the Bible, okay? But be careful, brother. There are a lot of us in this church. But you see how ahead of the time God was? I'm not even covering the other stuff. There are other scientists have written books about this stuff, but I'm just going over practical things that are easy to understand, that you can use in your day-to-day life. Like if somebody asks you, why do you believe there's a God? Why do you believe, it's okay to be, why do you think science doesn't conflict with God? Well, tell them these verses. All right, Leviticus 13 says, Leviticus 13, we'll read verses 1 through 4. Let's see here. So these are all really interesting topics when I was researching them. And this you'll kind of see what I'm getting at when you read these verses. And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, saying, when a man shall have in the skin of his flesh a scab or bright spot, and the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, saying, when a man shall have in the skin of his flesh a scab or bright spot, and it be in the skin of his flesh like the plague of leprosy, then he shall be brought unto Aaron the priest, or unto one of his sons the priests, and the priest shall look on the plague in the skin of the flesh. And when the hair in the plague is turned white, and the plague in sight be deeper than the skin of his flesh, it is a plague of leprosy. And the priest shall look on him and pronounce him unclean. If the bright spot be white in the skin of his flesh, and in sight be not deeper than the skin, and the hair thereof be not turned white, then the priest shall shut up him that hath the plague 7 days. Okay, pay attention to the last part where it says, shut up him that hath the plague 7 days. Oh my gosh, how am I going to say this that doesn't get censored? Hold on. In the last 3 years, what have you experienced very, very dearly in your normal life? It's the idea of quarantine, right? So when my parents visited Korea a couple of years ago, or not a couple of years ago, like last year or 2 years ago, I think they went, and they were under threat of being quarantined for the ailments that has been spreading across the world. That's all I'll say. But this idea of quarantine is mentioned here, right? Again, when was this book written? 1490 BC. I like BC because it means before Christ. But 1490 BC. Like 2,500 years ago, right? Now, it also has elements of diagnosis here because God's telling the priest exactly how to diagnose this ailment. He's like, if you look at it and it exhibits these symptoms and it looks like this, then it is this. So he's giving a diagnostic manual for the priest to follow. Interesting, right? How can he do that? Well, because he's God. He created us. God describes the practice of quarantining an infectious individual in this passage, as I said. And I know this, okay, the CDC states that this practice began in the 14th century in an effort to protect coastal cities from plague epidemics. Interesting, right? Again, book was written a long time ago, okay? There's no getting away from that. This book was written so long ago. All right. Now, we looked at quarantine, right? Let's look at a different concept in Leviticus 11. So Leviticus 11, We're going to look at verses 24 to 25, 28, and then 32 to 35. And I'm very sorry, I'm just going to read it because I don't want to take up too much time here. Leviticus 11, 24 to 25 says, "And for these ye shall be unclean. Whosoever toucheth the carcass of them shall be unclean until the even. And whosoever beareth aught of the carcass of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the even." Verse 28 says, "And he that beareth the carcass of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the even. They are unclean unto you." Verses 32 to 35 says, "And upon whatsoever any of them when they are dead doth fall, they shall be unclean, whether it be any vessel of wood, or raiment, or skin, or sack, whatsoever vessel it be, wherein any work is done, it must be put into water, and it shall be unclean until the even, so it shall be cleansed. And every earthen vessel whereinto any of them falleth, whatsoever is in it shall be unclean, and he shall break it. Of all meat which may be eaten, that on which such water cometh shall be unclean, and all drink that may be drunk in every such vessel shall be unclean, and everything whereupon any part of their carcass falleth shall be unclean, whether it be oven or ranges for pots, they shall be broken down, for they are unclean and shall be unclean unto you." This sounds like word salad, right? A lot of things, unclean, touching. But simply put, God is saying when you handle a carcass, you better wash yourself once you handle it, and you're considered unclean. Well, people 400 years ago would have said, well, why? Why are you unclean? What's the point of all these laws? Well, it turns out God has a very good understanding of this thing called the germ theory of disease, okay? This is let's see here. This is basically a modern theory, and this is what the theory is. The germ theory of disease is the currently accepted scientific theory for many diseases. It states that microorganisms known as pathogens or germs can lead to disease. These small organisms, too small to be seen without magnification, invade humans, other animals, and other living hosts. Their growth and reproduction within their hosts can cause disease. This theory, germ theory, was accepted and considered to be the predominant theory of disease transmission at the end of the 19th century. That's like 200 years ago. Some notable scientists whose works led to this acceptance of germ theory included Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. More than 2,500 years before Pasteur and Koch and other scientists were able to figure out the germ theory of disease, God wrote about it in Leviticus. By the way, this germ theory that God describes here about, you notice how he said if a part of a carcass even touches a vessel, like a pot or something, he said break it, right? I'm assuming because they didn't have antibiotics or all this soap stuff that we have today back in the day. So he says, instead of teaching you how to make this stuff, I'm just going to say break it. I think that's what the Lord is saying here. Just break it, get a new dish. But this is also the reason why if you cut raw meat on a piece of cutting board, you can't put raw vegetables for consumption on there and expect to not get sick, okay? God was way ahead of the time. You understand this? God was way ahead of the time. So interesting, right? You never thought this stuff was in the Bible, but God had a reason for putting this stuff. These for nerds like me, and other people who are interested in this stuff. Okay, so we get to another very interesting chapter, Job 38. This is actually really, really interesting. Or maybe not so interesting for some people, but I thought this was really interesting. Job 38, and I'm just going to read Job 38, 35, says, "Canst thou send lightnings that they may go and say unto thee, here we are? Who hath put..." It's just that verse. "Canst thou send lightnings that they may go and say unto thee, here we are?" What is this? By the way, this book of Job, this thing was estimated to have been written around 1790 BC or 1780 BC. This is like 4,000 years ago. This is a long time ago, okay? So the person who's writing this was probably, even the King James Bible translator was probably like, what does this even mean? But I guess the reason why we use the King James is going to be explained in a second. Here in this verse, God is telling Job about how he created the world that we live in. So the context is very important. This chapter deals with God telling Job, this is how I created the world. You see how important this context is? So he says here, basically this verse explains how communication devices work today. The word lightnings, right, might catch your fancy. You might say, what are these lightnings that, God is talking about. When you think of lightning, can we say we kind of think of energy when we think of lightning? Energy, right? Yeah. Okay. So phones today use electromagnetic waves, also called electromagnetic radiation or electromagnetic spectrum, whatever you want to call it, specifically radio waves to carry our voice from our phones to other phones. These waves travel at the speed of light, and if you don't know, the speed of light is very fast. It's like 300 million meters per second, if you can even think about how fast that is. It's very fast. But basically, this is these waves go from like your phone to a tower, and from the tower to another phone and stuff like that. There's a pathway that these things follow. That's how you communicate. You send lightnings from here to there, right, and they let you talk. You know, you notice what it says? Canst thou send lightnings that they may go and say unto thee, here we are. Pretty cool, right? These devices are constantly emitting electromagnetic radiation. Lightnings. Really cool, right? All right. So, again, the writer had no idea that he was talking about this stuff. But somehow in the King James Bible, it was translated in such a way that it just makes perfect sense in light of what we know today. By the way, electromagnetic waves, radiation, and energy, they're all the same thing. They basically refer to the physical phenomenon called electromagnetic energy. That's why I said energy in the beginning. But another interesting thing that I found was in Job 38, again, in verse 24, which says, by what way is the light parted which scattereth the east wind upon the earth? You might be like, what is this? Why do we care? What is this verse saying? By what way is the light parted? Focus on that part. Light parting? What do you mean? Does that make any sense to you? Probably not, right? If you take a really clear white light in a beam and you pass it through this device called a prism, you know what you get? You get 7 different visible colors. Isaac Newton, who believed in God, by the way, was the one who figured this out through his famous prism experiment. So I looked up how this experiment was supposed to be done. And the demonstrator took a white beam of light. He had a triangular prism. He shined light through it, and it just displays the rainbow. 7 colors, by the way, 7 colors. Really cool, right? Sean knows why I put the emphasis there, but anyways, there's 7 colors of the rainbow, and then when you put another prism in front of that, and you kind of fiddle around with it, you can demonstrate that this white light, these 7 colors, converge back into white light. So the Bible says, by what way is the light parted? Mind you, again, God is talking about how he created the world, the universe. That's important because he's saying, look, you understand what the visible light spectrum is? You know I created 7 colors and you only see it as white? You know? That's kind of what he's saying, but isn't that cool? So the visible light spectrum is part of the electromagnetic spectrum, okay? It's energy. Light is energy. And it can be classified with the same waves like radio waves, microwaves, and X-rays. I won't bore you with that. But this is really cool. If you told anybody even around Job's time, you know light parts, white light isn't really white and it consists of 7 different colors, they're going to look at you and be like, are you crazy? But I bet you even like in the 1500s, right? Like 100 years before the King James Bible was written, and about 100-something years before Newton discovered this thing, people would look at you funny. They'll look at you and say, what are you talking about? Right. But again, the Bible is very, very in line with modern science, right? Pretty cool. Revelation 11:9. This is a very famous verse, and Pastor Gene, when I talked to him the first time I met him, I think he told me about this, and I think what he said was that preachers back in the day, before they understood this verse, actually just preached it because they believed it. They didn't have any certainty about it, but they preached it because they believed it. Revelation 11:9 says, and they of the people and kindreds and tongues and nations shall see their dead bodies 3 days and a half, and shall not suffer their dead bodies to be put in graves. For some reason, the Antichrist is going to display the bodies of Moses and Elijah for 3 days and 3 nights. I don't know why, but he's going to do it. But how is that going to be done? You think preachers in the 1950s even understood this? No. Dr. Ruckman said it's probably television because at the time that was the best technology that they had for, viewing things across the world. What do we have today? We have live stream. Yep. Live stream, At any point in time, you can take one of these devices, you can go on Facebook or TikTok or YouTube, whatever other app that you have, you click a couple buttons and you're live. Right. By the way, there are broadcasts that last like days at a time. Like if you look at the International Space Station broadcast, they have it on all the time. Right. So is it that much of a stretch to say the Antichrist can do this in the future? We can do it already. Like the technology is here. He's just going to do it later. But due to the popularity and availability of live streaming, we know how the Antichrist is going to put their bodies on a pedestal, right? Pretty cool. And again, way ahead of the time. This is estimated to have been written in AD 96, by the way. This is like thousands of years ago. So the last one I'm going to cover is Genesis 30. Actually, I'm going to cover two more, and I'll do it quickly for the sake of time. So thank you for bearing with me. Hope this is helping you. Hope this is interesting because I always thought, younger Christians, I hope, and even people who aren't too interested in the sciences, I wanted to kind of make it easy and make it kind of interesting. Hopefully it is. Genesis 30, verses 37 to 43. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically, when you read it later, Jacob uses some sort of a trick to increase his herd. Pastor Gene, remember, talked about this? This technique is called artificial selection. And big words, right? Okay, the National Geographic Society states, artificial selection is the identification by humans of desirable traits in plants and animals and the steps taken to enhance and perpetuate those traits in future generations. What it really means is you see a bunch of animals, you see one animal that's like really strong and it's very big and you like it, you take that animal, you get another animal, and you see that it has the traits that you want, like size or color or whatever, you breed them together, and then what happens? You get the offspring with the same or similar genetics, and you have a different kind of creature that you wanted to have, that you desired, and you keep multiplying your flock that way, like Jacob did, because he took all the strong cows and cattle and he bred them together and using this technique of artificial selection, and he increased his herd. Now, I don't know the exact method, and I don't know if Pastor exactly told the method in which Jacob used to induce the mating between the cattle, but alas, that remains to be figured out. But one other interesting thing to note about spotted animals that Jacob chose, because Jacob chose the ring-streaked and spotted animals in this passage, okay? Well, there's a reason for that. The Smithsonian Magazine reports that the spots on cows can serve as bug repellent by confusing the vision of horseflies. The dark and light spots of some cows change how polarized light is reflected. All that means is it kind of changes light and how it's reflected, right? A similar effect was observed in zebras. So that pattern serves as kind of a bug repellent. Pretty cool, right? Some researchers got bored, I guess, and figured this out. Really interesting. Last one is Psalms 8:8. We'll close it off here. Thank you so much for bearing with me. I do apologize. We're running like a minute or two over time. But I promise this one is even more interesting. Psalms 8:8 says, "The fowl of the air and the fish of the sea and whatsoever passeth through the paths of the seas." 200 years ago, somebody might have been like, what are the paths of the seas? What are you talking about, man? They wouldn't have understood. But Matthew Maury, an American naval officer, credits his discovery of ocean currents to this verse. He specifically said, look, I read Psalm 8:8, and I thought, well, if there are paths in the seas, maybe I can find them. So he went out and found them. And now they're called ocean currents. Now, Wikipedia, this is information from the National Ocean Service, states, an ocean current is a continuous directed movement of seawater generated by a number of forces acting upon the water, including wind, the Coriolis effect, breaking waves, cabling, and temperature and salinity differences. You don't have to know all that, but basically, ocean currents exist, and they're very useful because knowledge of surface ocean currents is essential in reducing costs of shipping, since traveling with them reduces fuel costs. Pretty cool, right? They're kind of like roads in the ocean. That's kind of how I view them, and they make it easier for you to travel. And the Lord knew exactly this. That's why he said, look, I made paths in the seas for you. Amen. All right. So I hope this was helpful and kind of interesting. I know it could be a little dense, but I hope this kind of gave you some ammo and some food for thought that maybe science isn't so contrary to, the Bible after all. Maybe it actually enhances our belief that God knew what he was talking about when he wrote the book. Amen. Let's close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for revealing so many cool things in your word. I pray that this was a blessing and that people were able to understand it and that it wasn't too dense and that it was enjoyable and that they have some ammo to reinforce their beliefs in light of all the opposition that we face today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.